Hello, everyone. Welcome to The Writing Cabin with Tarah Benner. I'm paranormal fantasy author Tarah Benner, and this is my cabin. We all need to escape into story from time to time. So come on in, sit down by the fire, pour yourself a nice hot cup of coffee, and let's talk books. Now, today I have a very special announcement to make before we continue our series of The Fae Hunt. Right now, Better Off Dead, which is book 1 in Mountain Shadow Mysteries, is available for pre-order. So do go onto Amazon and pre-order your copy of that and email me proof of your pre-order, either a screenshot or a photo of your receipt, and I will enter you to win my special pre-order only giveaway. I've put a link to that all down in the show notes or in the YouTube video notes down below. As we have been doing the last few weeks, instead of our usual show, I am narrating the novella The Fae Hunt, which is a patrons only novella that I am pulling out of the vault just for the Writing Cabin listeners and viewers on YouTube. This is the 5th and final installment, so enjoy. A tingle of panic swept over Fiona, raising the hairs along the back of her neck. Baylock, Gabriel spat, glancing around for the source of the voice. I am so pleased you're here. And where is here exactly? All in good time, my friend. Baylock laughed, and Fiona felt the sound rattle her sternum. It bothered her that she couldn't see Baylock. The fog was so thick she couldn't see more than a few feet in front of her, and she began to think that the disembodied voice might be coming from the fog itself. Show yourself, Gabriel bellowed, turning in a slow circle. Now that Fiona was paying attention, she could sense a cloud of ether surrounding them. It felt almost like a force field. Rather than sharpening her senses as ether normally did, it seemed to dull them. For years my kind have been cut off from their home, Baylock's voice rumbled. Forced to endure your world or journey far away to find a portal back to our homeland. The Fae ether was getting to her. Fiona was beginning to feel slow and foggy, and it stoked the fear in her heart. Gabriel must have been experiencing something similar, because he blinked several times very fast. She had a sudden vision of Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, stumbling through the enchanted poppy field and falling asleep. I think it fitting that you should be trapped, mused Baylock, forced to wander through the land of your enemies until the end of time. Fiona swallowed. She didn't like the sound of that. She'd read that the Fae were very precise in their choice of words. Baylock hadn't said, until the end of your days. He specifically said, the end of time, and Fiona was reminded of the old Irish legend of Uiscin de Tirnanog, the land of youth, where no one ever grew old and died. Honestly, I'm not sure I'd make it until the end of time, said Gabriel, raising his axe overhead. I've made quite a lot of enemies in fairyland. Suddenly, there was a dark ripple through the fog, and Fiona heard the beating of wings. There was a flash of black and white feathers, and a giant magpie swooped overhead. As its brilliant blue-green plumage caught the light, Fiona saw that it was as tall as a man with at least a 20-foot wingspan. Gabriel ducked to avoid being walloped by the bird, which landed neatly on a fallen log. As they watched, its wings began to dissolve into the thick fog that surrounded them. Its beak twitched and started to flatten, and its beady black eyes shrank into its head. Fiona blinked, thinking her eyes were playing tricks on her, and the bird just melted away. A gray-haired man stood in its place. He had a round middle and a neatly trimmed beard, and was dressed in a tunic and pants that were woven from the same homespun linen. It was Baylock. How are we in Elfame? Fiona demanded. I thought there were no other portals. I created a new one, said Baylock simply, though it wasn't easy. How did you do it? All in good time, said Baylock cheerfully. We are just getting started. No, said Gabriel. This is the end for you. Gabriel lunged forward with his axe, but Baylock simply vanished. He reappeared as Gabriel's blade sank into the fallen log and made an annoying tutting sound. My dear friends, there is no need for bloodshed today. I do not wish to kill you, Master Pierce. He sucked in a short breath of relish. I find that death is too final, and the spoils too short-lived. Well, that's too bad, Gabriel muttered, freeing his axe head from the log, 'cause I really enjoy killing Fae. This time, Fiona only saw the slightest twitch of Gabriel's arm before he released the axe. A split second later, there was a glint of metal as it hurtled toward Balok's head. It moved so fast that Fiona couldn't follow it with her eyes, and the head of the axe sank into a tree with a satisfying thud. Fiona squinted as bits of tree bark went flying. The tree in question had been directly behind Balok, but the Fae had disappeared again. Do you really think you can best me here? He chuckled. You, a mere hunter? Fiona wheeled around. Balok was sitting in one of the enormous old-growth trees, his legs dangling playfully. On his feet he wore a pair of leather boots that looked as though they'd come straight from the Dark Ages. I'm willing to die trying, Gabriel growled, reaching behind his back. Suddenly Fiona understood why Gabriel's hiking pack had such an unusual shape. From a pair of heavy-duty canvas sheaths, he pulled 2 short swords with leather grips and smooth black stones set into the pommels. She'd wondered where he'd gotten those. Like Balok's boots and homespun clothes, they appeared to have been made in another time. But if you prefer to flit around like a bird than face me in a real fight, said Gabriel. If he'd been hoping to goad the Fae into a sword fight, it didn't work. A slow smirk spread across Balok's face. I am an old man, Master Pierce. Why fight when I can fly? Hunters and witches can't survive for long outside your world. You are already weakened. I can see it in your face. You will tire quickly. It was true. Gabriel had been doing a good job of hiding it, but Fiona could read the fatigue on his face and in the slightly stooped set of his shoulders. Where's Jinx? Fiona asked. Balok's eyes darted this way and that in an infuriatingly playful manner. She is around. Let her go, snapped Gabriel. Why, Master Pierce, I am not holding your friend hostage. She may leave whenever she likes. You could all leave if you just knew the way. Show them out then, said Gabriel. Jinx and Fiona, your fight is with me, not them. Now why would I help your friends? You have nothing that I want. I already have you right where I want you. You have no leverage whatsoever. Gabriel glanced at Fiona, who was struggling to clear her head. Something like smugness lit Gabriel's sharp eyes, or maybe the Fae magic was just clouding her mind. How about a friendly wager? Said Gabriel. What? Fiona snapped, glaring at Gabriel. He couldn't be serious. Only an idiot would make a wager with a fairy. The Fae were notorious tricksters. They had a knack for taking advantage of mortals' greed, twisting their words, and saddling them with an eternity of misery. I'm listening, said Balok, looking more than ever like a magpie as his beady eyes blinked at Gabriel with interest. For 1 hour, I'll be your slave. But if Fiona can find her way out of this place within the hour, you'll let the 3 of us go. My only condition is that you tell us how you created the portal before the start of the hour. 1 hour, the Fae scoffed. An hour of servitude is worth nothing to me, certainly not for what you're asking. If I tell you how I created the portal, what's to stop you from destroying it the way you destroyed the last one? First of all, we're in Elfame, said Gabriel grimly. I know you can make an hour last however long you want. Balok didn't contradict him, and Fiona could tell from the annoyed flick of his eyes that Gabriel spoke the truth. Besides that, I'm assuming you've put safeguards in place to ensure this portal can't be destroyed so easily, said Gabriel. Balok's eyes flashed in interest as he considered Gabriel's wager. 1 hour. 1 hour, Gabriel agreed. And Fiona, myself, and Jinx may leave here unharmed and return to the time and place from whence we came. Gabriel's use of the archaic whence made Fiona think he'd used some very specific wording to counteract the Fae's tricks. And if she should fail? Balok probed. Gabriel swallowed. If she should fail, I'll be your slave for 1 year, which might as well be 300 years here. What? Fiona hissed. No! She was liking this deal less and less. Gabriel's mouth tightened into a hard line, but he didn't take it back. You seem to forget that I could make you my slave with a flap of my wings, said Balok, looking more like a bird than ever as he cocked his head to the side. You'd have to use magic to steal my will. I'm sure it would be much more satisfying for me to submit to you myself. Judging by the old Fae's silent regard, he was tempted by the offer. "Very well," said Balak after a moment. "You will come with me, and we shall see if Mistress Grimes can find her way back to your world." Oh, great, Fiona thought. So it all came down to her. If she succeeded, they could leave. If she failed, she, Gabriel, and Jinx would be stuck in Elfhame for eternity. "First you have to tell us how you created the portal." Balak's mouth twisted in a way that told Fiona he really didn't like sharing that information. Still, a bargain was a bargain. The Fae didn't go back on their word, not if they couldn't find a loophole. "There is a ridge on this very mountain where grows a 2,000-year-old bristlecone pine," Balak began. "It is not a beautiful or stately tree. It is old and ugly and weathered by time, but it is rumored to have magical properties." He took a big breath, his eyebrows lowering as though he resented telling them the story. "What makes the tree remarkable isn't its age precisely, but rather that it hails from a time when our kind freely roamed the earth." "The Dark Ages?" "Yes, and the time before. As the legend goes, a Fae from the old country traveled to your land before the Europeans came to America. This Fae was in possession of a stone that allowed him to travel through space and time, even to other worlds. No one knows how he acquired the stone or where it came from, only that the Fae asked to be taken to the most beautiful place on earth. There are different versions of the story, but one version says the stone brought him here, to the Rocky Mountains." "Is there a point to all this?" Gabriel asked, looking bored by the magpie story. Balak shot him a dirty look. "When the Fae first saw the Rocky Mountains, he was awestruck. He traveled all around the Americas and fell in love with her great blue rivers and the mountains and all the creatures that roamed the plains. But he also knew it was a land rich in resources that would bring bloodshed, destruction, war among the mortals, if it was discovered by the white man. He knew the stone was too dangerous to keep, for if it fell into mortal hands and brought them here, they would destroy the land out of greed. So he climbed to the top of the tallest mountain he could find, carved a hole in the tree, and hid the stone. Eventually, the tree grew around the hole, and the stone's magic kept it alive. 2 millennia of storms have battered this mountain. The tree has withstood rain and snow, being struck by lightning, and even a clear cut of the surrounding forest." "And you found the stone?" Fiona asked. "No," Balak admitted. "But I found the tree, as hard and impenetrable as the stone inside it. The tree's location is known to only a handful of people, most of them mortal scientists. Very carefully, I took some of the ancient tree and grafted it onto another, one that would be suitable for creating a portal to our world." "Why not just make a portal from the original tree?" asked Fiona, horrified that the Fae had wounded the ancient tree to graft it onto another. "The original tree is constantly being studied for insight into weather patterns and climate change. I couldn't risk creating a portal where mortals could easily fall through to our world. So they were looking for a tree that was a portal between worlds." "Great," Fiona thought. "How hard could it be to find a tree in the middle of a giant forest?" "Good luck," said Gabriel, as though he'd read her mind. Fiona didn't immediately realize that they'd reached the end of Balak's story, but a second later, his whole body shivered and sprouted wings as he morphed back into a bird. She watched the grotesque show with a mixture of horror and fascination. Balak's nose lengthened as his head grew rounder and more bulbous. His back arched, and his bones snapped as he sprouted a pair of gigantic wings. The magpie alighted from the branch in an ungainly flap of wings. He dove so fast that Fiona was forced to leap out of the way to avoid being knocked aside. He snatched up Gabriel in its talons and pulled out of his dive without brushing the ground. Gabriel yelled and then went very quiet, and Fiona worried he'd been crushed. She watched anxiously as they rose toward the canopy, but they quickly disappeared from sight. She stared after them for several seconds, still shocked by the Fae's transformation. 1 hour, she thought, pulling herself out of her trance and glancing down at her watch. She gave a start, blinking quickly to be sure of what she was seeing. The glass face of her watch was shattered, and none of the hands were moving. Perfect, she said aloud, shivering in the cold mist. Now she had no way to tell how much time had passed. The sky in Elfham was no help. She couldn't even see the sun through the thick canopy, and the small patches of sky that were visible through the trees were a uniform steely gray. Right, she thought. How hard could it be? She simply had to retrace her steps. Fiona turned to walk back down the trail in the direction they'd come from, hugging herself to ward off the cold. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees, and it seemed to be getting colder by the minute. She picked up her pace as she shuffled down the trail, passing the tree that had been struck by lightning. A light frost had begun to collect on the foliage and fallen trees, making everything look as though it had been dusted with a fine white glitter. Her teeth began to chatter, and she realized she couldn't feel her feet. She wasn't sure if it was the magic or hypothermia that was making her head so fuzzy. She was having a hard time concentrating on the task at hand. All she could think about was the cold. When Fiona passed the tree that had been struck by lightning, she briefly considered curling up inside to get warm. At least it would provide shelter from the cold breeze that nipped through her clothes. Maybe she would light a fire and just lay down for a moment. Wait. Fiona stopped and shook her head, glancing back at the tree. She'd just passed it a moment before. Was she going in a circle? No. She couldn't be. There was only a single path to follow. No turns or places the trail split off. What was going on? Somewhere in the forest, an owl hooted ominously, and she heard a loud flap of wings that made her whole body stiffen. Was it an owl or the magpie flying in to taunt her? Giving herself a sobering shake, Fiona trudged on, resolving to pay better attention to her surroundings so she would know if she passed the same landmark twice. She noted a rock shaped like a pile of books and a fallen log with branches twisted like a coat rack. She was so engrossed in everything at eye level that she wasn't watching her step. She was also power walking in an effort to keep warm, so when the toe of her boot caught on a tree root, she pitched forward too fast to correct her balance. She slammed face first into the ground, scraping her palms as she tried to break her fall. Fiona groaned and pushed herself up. Her wrists hurt from how she landed, and she had bloody scrapes on both palms. Perfect. She made to stand up, but something tightened around her ankle. Fiona tried to pull against it, but then her heart leapt into her throat. The thing was pulling back. She whipped around to see what had grabbed her and saw a tree root wrapped around her ankle. It was slithering around her like a snake, its dry bark cracking as it bent. "Gah!" she exclaimed, shaking her foot to try to dislodge it. But the tree root only tightened its grip, the bark cutting into her skin. "Get off of me," Fiona growled, tugging harder against the root. But the tree root was too strong to break, and its grip seemed to grow tighter the harder Fiona pulled. Closing her eyes, Fiona focused on her command of the elements. She concentrated on the water inside the tree and drew it out through the bark. The air was so cold that the water froze, creating a layer of frost on the bark. The tree root crackled as it froze, turning brittle and weak. Fiona tugged again. This time, the wood split where she applied pressure, and she managed to free her ankle. She sprang to her feet as quickly as she could and started sprinting down the trail. She whipped past familiar landmarks, and her heart leapt with hope. Maybe she would find her way out after all and be able to save herself and her friends. But then the ground in front of her split, and she skidded to a sudden halt. A giant root emerged from the crack in the ground, twisting and bending like a living thing, stretching after a very long slumber. The tree root was at least a foot in diameter, large enough to squeeze her to death. Fiona watched in terror as the root shook itself, flinging off great clumps of dirt like a dog trying to dry itself. Then there was another loud crack behind her. Fiona wheeled around and saw that more roots were breaking out from the ground. The forest floor trembled as the roots emerged, tearing up the trail as they appeared and spraying her with dirt. Fiona was so transfixed by the scene that she didn't notice a giant root shivering in her periphery. She only felt the scratchy embrace of bark as the root wrapped itself around her. Fiona screamed, and another root slithered up her leg. She tried to back up, but she couldn't move. The roots held her in place. At first, she thought they were going to strangle her, but then she felt a push and a tug. The roots stretched, lifting her clean off her feet, before tossing her through the air like a sling stone. Fiona's stomach flew into her throat as she hurtled through the trees. She screamed as branches whipped her in the face, cutting her face and arms. She landed with a thud in a small clearing, and the impact forced all the air from her lungs. Her back screamed in protest. She hurt everywhere, though nothing seemed to be broken. Gasping for breath, Fiona lifted her head. She was lying a good 20 yards from the trail. Thankfully, she'd had a soft landing on a bed of neon green moss. The stuff was damp and cool to the touch, and seemed to cover every inch of dirt beneath an enormous oak tree. Breathing deeply to fill her lungs, Fiona looked back at the trail. The tree roots were withdrawing, sliding back into the ground and fitting themselves into the holes. There was a great hiss like dry rice being poured into a bowl, and she realized the dirt was spilling back into the enormous trenches to cover the roots. A moment later, it was as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. The trail looked exactly the way it had the first time Fiona had passed through the forest, apart from the patches of loose earth. Fairies, Fiona huffed in exasperation, pushing herself into a seated position. She didn't appreciate their little games, especially when they involved her. She got to her feet and brushed herself off, worrying about how much time she'd wasted walking down the same stretch of trail. If the path itself was enchanted, she couldn't go that way again. She'd have to venture off the trail and try to find her way back to the switchback. Fiona lurched forward to blaze a path through the undergrowth, but found she couldn't move her feet. She swayed on the spot, nearly face-planting, looked down at her legs, and gave a start. Her feet were no longer visible at all. They'd sunk into the squishy moss. She tried to lift one foot out, but it was as if someone had glued it to the ground. This wasn't ordinary moss, she realized. It was enchanted fairy moss. Damn! Trying very hard not to panic, Fiona gave her leg a tug and tried to jiggle it free. But her foot only seemed to sink deeper, as if she were standing in quicksand. She tried to wriggle out of her boot, but it was laced up too tightly. Fantastic, Fiona growled as she felt the damp moss brush her ankle. She was sinking deeper by the second. The moss was cool and pillowy soft to the touch, and when she bent forward and stuck her finger in it, it took a good yank to get it back out. The moss was emanating fey magic, and she detected a faint whispering sound that seemed to be coming from the moss itself. Creepy, she thought, trying very hard not to panic so that she could problem solve. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes, concentrating on drawing the water from the moss so that it would dry out and die. When she opened her eyes again, she saw the water condensing along the top of the moss. She breathed in and raised her hand to draw the water into the air, but the moss didn't shrivel and die. Fiona allowed a growl of frustration. Either the moss was smarter than the tree had been, or Balak was keeping an eye on her. She suspected the fae had enchanted the moss to draw moisture from the soil as fast as she could pull it out. Fiona swore and closed her eyes again, racking her brain for another idea. She didn't think fire would work, not since she was ankle deep in the moss. Causing an earthquake also seemed risky, given that she would be in the eye of the storm. She vaguely recalled that Agatha had had a problem with moss on the north side of her house after she'd installed a sprinkler system. What had she used to kill the moss? Something called moss out, Fiona remembered, which contained ferrous sulfate. Iron, she said out loud, laughing the instant she thought of it. Iron killed moss by drawing out the moisture. Iron also happened to be the fae's kryptonite, which meant it would also weaken the enchantments. She had an idea. Reaching into her pocket, Fiona withdrew the knife Gabriel had given her, the one with the mother-of-pearl handle. It had once belonged to his grandmother and had an engraving on the blade. Never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake. The blade was steel that had been polished to a shine, and steel was made of iron. Clicking the little golden lock on the side, Fiona drew the blade and held the knife flat across her palm. Drawing on her command of the earth element, she concentrated on breaking down the steel to iron and carbon. Faster than she expected, she felt the metal burning her palm. Fiona dropped the knife and watched in fascination as the blade glowed bright orange. It burned straight through the bed of moss, glowing a brighter red as it heated. Fiona focused on separating the iron from the carbon and drawing the iron through the moss. Dark flakes of iron rose through the air like particles of dust, and she let it cascade back down over the moss, which was by then halfway up her knees. Where the iron touched the moss, it began to sizzle before turning black and crumbling. Fiona wiggled her foot experimentally and found she was able to get free. "Oh, the irony," she said to herself, hoping Balak was listening. "The thing that kills moss also kills fey magic." She chuckled at her own joke. What were the odds that her gardening knowledge would turn out to be life-saving information? Still shaking a little from the adrenaline, she stomped through the undergrowth in the direction they'd come once they'd entered the woods. "Looking for a tree," Fiona muttered to herself. "A very weird tree with a 2,000-year-old craft imbued with magical powers." If it was magic, Fiona reasoned, she should be able to sense it. Trouble was, the entire forest seemed to hum with fey magic. It was overloading her senses, which would make it difficult to pick out anything that was emanating an unusual amount of ether. But as she kept walking, Fiona noticed that the tingling seemed fainter than it had before. She looked around. It was hard to know for sure, but it seemed that she'd gotten a bit off track. She could no longer see the trail at all. She kept walking, purposely blazing a path perpendicular to the trail. The magic in the air grew fainter still until she could barely feel it. Looking around, Fiona noticed that the fog had lifted. She could actually see sunlight breaking through the trees, warming her skin where it trickled through the canopy. Intrigued, Fiona retraced her steps. Almost immediately, the air grew colder again, and the silver mist reappeared. It was as if the trail was generating its own climate. She didn't know how that was possible. Surely, if they were on Elfhame, the Fae's magic would be consistent. Unless they weren't in Elfhame. The second it occurred to her, Fiona knew she was onto something. But there was one piece of the puzzle that didn't make sense. As far as she knew, the Fae couldn't lie. Fiona thought back to their talk with Balak. When she replayed their conversation, she realized he'd never actually said they were in Elfhame. He just hadn't corrected them when they leapt to that conclusion. They definitely weren't in their world, but Fiona didn't think they were in Elfhame either. Maybe this place was some sort of limbo, a world between worlds, she thought. Excited, Fiona retraced her steps through the undergrowth, trying to get back to the trail. If the Fae magic was strongest along the trail, then surely the trail would lead her back to the portal. Fiona was determined to follow it back without getting lost, but it was several minutes before she realized she'd lost her bearings entirely. She should have reached the trail by then, but she couldn't find it. The fog had thickened beneath the trees, making it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Her teeth chattered as she walked, and she could feel her head getting fuzzy again. "Focus," she whispered, drawing her arms around herself to stay warm. She had to find her way back to the trail so she could find the portal. But before she'd taken another step, she heard her name in the distance. The voice was low and full of anguish. "Gabriel." "I'm here," Fiona called, wheeling around in the direction of the voice and listening intently. "Fiona!" Something about the strain of torture in Gabriel's voice made Fiona's blood run cold. "I'm coming!" Fiona took off at a dead sprint. Or, rather, she set off at an ungainly run, keeping her eyes on the ground to avoid tripping over a rock or fallen tree. "Fiona!" This time it was a different voice. Jinx, and it was coming from the opposite direction. Fiona stopped. She heard Gabriel call again, but something wasn't right. The voice wasn't coming from where she first heard it. It seemed to be emanating from the area she'd just left. She recalled what Gabriel had said about the Fae being able to stretch time or make it pass more slowly. If they could manipulate time and make her lose her way on the trail, surely they could make her think she was hearing things. "Get a grip," she told herself firmly. "It isn't real." At least she hoped it wasn't. She needed a way to block out all distractions and find her way back to the trail. If she could find the trail, she could find the portal. Then again, maybe the trail itself was the portal and the grafted tree only an entry point. She needed to sense the ether to be sure, and for that she needed to focus. Fiona knew what she had to do, but it seemed crazy to close her eyes in this forest. She couldn't trust the tree roots not to move, or the moss not to try to swallow her again. But she did it anyway. With her eyes closed, she wasn't distracted by the fog, and she could more easily block out Gabriel and Jinx's voices. Taking a deep breath, Fiona reached out with her senses and allowed the tingle of fey magic to wash over her skin like static electricity. She took a few careful steps forward and noticed that the tingling seemed to intensify. She took 5 more steps, tripped, and steadied herself. She was definitely moving in the right direction. It was slow going, but Fiona managed a dozen more paces until she could feel the magic buzzing on her lips. It grew stronger with every step she took, and she began to hear the faint hiss of voices coming from up ahead. The voices grew clearer as she walked. They were urging her not to go any farther, but Fiona knew better than to trust them. As her feet found the smooth dirt surface of the trail, she was able to quicken her pace, though she still didn't dare open her eyes. She just kept walking into the headwind of magic, moving as fast as she dared. The icy fog made her skin tingle, joining with the buzz of magic. Fiona broke into a half run, trying to shut out the sharp whispers that were growing louder and louder all around her. Smack! Fiona's eyes flew open on impact, and she quickly blinked back stars. She'd hit her head on a low-hanging tree, one that was bent over the trail like an archway. The tree itself was practically vibrating with fey ether. It had to be the portal. Sure enough, when she followed the arch of the gnarled trunk, she saw a faint line of bark that wasn't like the rest. The grafted portal from the enchanted tree was yellowish-orange and was worn smooth by years of exposure to the elements. It looked as hard as stone. Fiona reached out, drawn by the magic, but stopped with her hand less than an inch from the bark. She pulled it back as if she'd been burned and ducked under the tree trunk instead. The instant she stepped through the portal, it was as though she'd been walking around with fogged-up glasses and finally taken them off. The heavy fog lifted, and a burst of sunshine warmed her face. There was no frost on the ground in front of her, and she found herself in a coniferous forest that looked and smelled familiar. Something on the ground caught her eye, a single bluish-green feather. She bent down to pick it up and caught a familiar tingle of fey magic. Fiona? Her stomach tightened with dread as she turned, prepared for another trick. Instead, she saw Gabriel walking toward her down the trail, looking shaken but unharmed. Fiona! Jinx was coming up right behind him. We've been looking everywhere for you. Fiona backed up so they could step through the portal, half expecting them to disappear. But they simply ducked their heads to pass under the tree trunk, and Gabriel's worried expression slid into irritation. Maybe warn us the next time you decide to wander off the trail? I thought I was going to have to call search and rescue. Huh? We've been looking for you, said Jinx. Where did you go? Never mind that, said Gabriel. Let's just go home. But what about Balok? Fiona asked, still not understanding. It's too late to try to find him today. A storm's moving in. We need to get back to the car. What? Jinx frowned at her. We talked to Balok, said Fiona slowly. He trapped us in Elfame, or a portal between our world and Elfame. I'm not sure. You were his slave for an hour. I had to find my way back here. Gabriel was staring at Fiona as though she'd lost her mind. Then his gaze slid to Jinx, who looked equally confused. I was Balok's slave for an hour, he repeated, his mouth twitching into a smirk. That's a little raunchy. You don't remember any of it? Fiona couldn't believe it. No, said Gabriel, because it didn't happen. We walked about a mile in, and then you disappeared. We've been looking for you for the last hour. So she hadn't been imagining their voices. Or had she? She still didn't know what had happened to Jinx in there. And how did Gabriel not remember being Balok's slave? Was that another of the Fae's tricks? Fiona looked from one of them to the other, wondering how they'd forgotten everything that had happened in the portal. She would never forget the madness and terror she'd felt back there. Terror that she would not escape. It was a wonder they could forget. But then, perhaps it was for the best, she thought. Or maybe this was Balok's last little bit of revenge, to make her question her own sanity. Either way, she supposed she should be grateful. She was probably the only witch in history to get trapped between this world and Elfhame and find her way back out. "Come on," said Gabriel, studying Fiona with renewed concern. "Let's get off this stupid mountain and get some breakfast. I think your blood sugar must be low." That concludes The Fae Hunt, a Witches of Mountain Shadow novella. If you enjoyed this story, you would probably like all the other Witches of Mountain Shadow stories that my patrons have exclusive access to. You can join at patreon.com/Tarah Labs, and you will gain immediate access to that entire library of stories. Again, that's patreon.com/Tarah Labs. I will be back next week with our regular show and updates on my upcoming new series. Until next time, happy reading.